I'm Vicki Hogarth, and welcome to Southwest Magazine. My guest today is the president and CEO of New Brunswick Community College, Mary Butler. She's here to speak with us about the federal government's recent decision to put a cap on the number of international student permits, as well as everything exciting coming up at NBCC. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mary.
Well, thank you for having me and for taking an interest in NBCC.
I'd love to start off by talking about something that's made national headlines. It's this international student permit cap that the federal government has put in place. Obviously, those of us close to an NBCC campus know how important international students are, not just to the college, but the community around them. Can you tell us a little bit about how this is affecting NBCC, and what does it mean in terms of the number of students you're able to accept next year?
Okay. Well, I don't think it's a secret that this was a surprise, not just to institutions across the country, but certainly to our provincial governments as well. I'll start with the good news. The good news is that our provincial government worked very collaboratively with all of our post-secondary, our public and private post-secondary institutions to come up with a collective solution. We knew that for New Brunswick to get a process in place and start receiving applications again meant that we needed to work quickly and we needed to work collaboratively, and that happened. The other thing that was really encouraging is that when our province looked at the allocation across institutions, which you can imagine is really complicated, complex, and you know, there's a lot of factors to consider, they really focused in on enrollment that institutions had and alignment to the labor market, because again, that's what's really important to the employers that we serve across the province, the industries that depend on all of our graduates to compete and to grow. So that's the good news. The challenge is that, you know, they're looking at a reduction across the board, and certainly the provincial allocation is based on a national conversion rate, which is much higher. It's 60% compared to what we typically see at NBCC within New Brunswick and across the Maritimes. So that's been a challenge for institutions and provinces that are reliant on international students who use education as a route to immigration. It becomes challenging to meet those labor market demands. So that's something we're grappling with and trying to make lemonade out of lemons.
Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of New Brunswick and the number of international students that come here, stay, and then become a part of the fabric of our communities?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we know from the provincial stats that the number of job vacancies is growing as we have a huge wave of retirements, and as industries are trying to grow, that replacement factor is about 133,000 job vacancies. And we can't fill that on New Brunswickers alone, which means we do need to recruit people from outside of the province. And we've had some in recent years from other parts of Canada, but we're really reliant on bringing international people into the province to help meet those needs. But you have to pair that with community readiness as well. And we did see some stress and strain on our communities this past fall with a big influx of international students, not just at NBCC, but across other institutions. You know, there was a shortage of housing. There was, you know, students struggling to find a place to live, daycare for children, food. So there are a lot of wraparound support and community services required to really allow people not just to come and settle for school, but to settle and become part of the community and part of the workforce.
Did this cap seem to come out of nowhere, and how did you pivot to make it work for next year?
Yeah, well, there were signs as far back as August. You know, the federal government was signaling that because of community readiness, we were going to have to make adjustments. So they were sending those signals 5 months before an announcement ever came. So NBCC, our teams were already adjusting and saying, how can we optimize enrollment to make sure that we continue to serve international students, which are vital for our labor pipeline as well. But also, how do we increase domestic participation? Because one of the things we face in New Brunswick is one of the lowest post-secondary education attainment rates in the country. So we know that New Brunswickers are not served at the same level across the country as others across the country. So we're interested in raising participation rates because that means greater participation in the labor force, more job security, higher wages, better health and social outcomes. So we're trying to match those things. And you asked about retention, so I apologize for not answering it just before, but when we look at our international graduates, the vast majority of them are still here in the first year following graduation, and 3 years later, almost half of them remain in New Brunswick and are employed and are part of our economic and social fabric of the province. That's the highest, I'll just say, among post-secondary institutions in the province. So we're really proud of the fact that we are achieving that alignment to the labor force, and we are creating that pipeline for labor force development and immigration.
Well, and I see it right here in my own community in St. Andrews, where we have a campus, and it's the most beautiful thing to see our community grow on so many different levels. For people who might not understand fully what the CAP means, can you talk about how it pertains to acceptance letters you're able to send, and again, what that conversion rate means from sending a letter to actually having a student come to the school?
Yeah. So historically, you know, someone typically finds us online or by word of mouth, or possibly at an education fair or that sort of thing, and they decide, first of all, they have to decide that Canada is where they'd like to study. And then they look across and they, you know, decide that New Brunswick has a lot to offer, and it's a great place not just to go to school, but potentially to settle if that's what they're interested in. So they will apply to the school, and in the past we were able to you know, approve those applications, give them a letter of acceptance based on meeting the criteria for the program. They take that and apply for their student visa, and then they get approved or not approved by the federal government to come. In the past, our approval rate's been about 35%, which means for every 100 international applicants interested in coming to study, only about 35 actually end up getting approved and actually making the journey and coming and starting a program with us at NBCC. So it makes it a little hard to predict how many will come, but we do have some historical numbers. Again, that's where the challenge comes in with the federal allocation, is that it's based on 60% of those applicants getting approved, which is not historically correct for New Brunswick. So what that means is that institutions right now, and all of us are working together to figure this out as quickly as we can, are trying to find ways to help these applicants be as successful as possible in that application process. Because we're only given so many attestation letters, so NBCC got 2,794. And so that's all we get. They can't be recycled. And so everyone needs to count, not just for us, but for the students that are placing their hopes and dreams on coming to Canada. So our team has put together a series of webinars, because there's a lot to the application process, and there can be some variations and nuances even in meeting Canadian standards by country. And so we're putting together a series of webinars to really support them at each and every stage, as I said, to help them build the strongest application possible. And then the rest is going to be up to the federal government.
Wow. So Mary, what does it mean for next year in terms of how you feel prepared, and what are your concerns?
Okay. I'm not sure. They've said this is going to be a 2-year reduction. And just to give you some perspective, based on our conversion rates, New Brunswick, we expected to receive somewhere around 17,000 applications, or that's what we would need in order to maintain enrollment. So we're looking at already taking a potential reduction in international learners in the province. And the biggest challenge this year, Vicki, and the reason I say it about next year, is that we've had basically a 3-month gap in our admissions cycle for fall 2024. That's going to set institutions back in terms of processing times and getting students in, and even the amount of preparation that's required for international students to make this transition, because they have to move, right? And there's a lot to wrapping up your home and life in another country and then moving and getting settled and starting school in another. So one of the concerns that we have, at first it was, oh my goodness, we're not going to have enough to maintain enrollment. And now we're looking at this big gap and saying, Well, what happens if, because of those delays, we don't utilize all of them this year? Is the government going to see that as underutilization and will be penalized for it next year? Our hope is that they'll recognize what a turbulent time it was and how challenging it was for provinces and institutions to put in place whole new processes, communicate those at the time in the admission cycle that it is, and at least maintain, if not even recognize the need, as I said, based on conversion rates, to increase the number of applications. So those are some of the challenges we face, and it will be interesting to see where it goes next year.
Does it seem, from a perspective of a province that isn't central, I would say that if an international student across the world is applying, they would know Toronto. And sometimes when we're in a province like New Brunswick, we're used to being second choice. We know once you've come here, you'll experience how beautiful and amazing it is.
Yeah.
But are they factoring in federally that provinces that aren't Quebec and Ontario might not be everyone's first choice, and so that it would be harder to implement this, not knowing who's going to say yes?
Well, it's certainly well known, not to date myself or things, but there is a reference in post-secondary about MTV, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and the Atlantic provinces, do get overlooked sometimes for those major cities. The one thing that we have going for us is the quality of life, right? And the support services that students get here. We have much lower numbers in terms of our class sizes, and so they get a much more personalized approach. We have not only support services internally within our institutions and within NBCC, but in our communities. We all know this is part of our population growth strategy. So that certainly is a factor, and we get a lot of referrals, lots of people that are successful that, they refer family and friends back home. And so word of mouth is really powerful in our market. But you're absolutely right, that we're not necessarily the first place that people look. And so it is more difficult to recruit. And I think that's reflected in our conversion rates.
And I wonder too, from seeing those headlines, if you were an international student thinking of coming to Canada, if that would, I even look at some of our volunteers here who are going on to university next year, when they heard about Quebec tuition rates going up at McGill and Concordia, immediately it was, okay, we're not going to bother applying there. And I had to convince a couple of them to do it anyway and wait and see what happens. But I imagine that you must have feedback internationally from people wondering if it's even worth the bother of coming to Canada, just in general.
Yeah, that's been one of the concerns from the start, is our reputation globally. And make no mistake, there were other countries that right off the mark leveraged that to try to promote themselves ahead of Canada. So, just before Christmas, before the announcement in January, there was an announcement to the amount of money that international students had to show that they had to ensure their financial preparedness for coming to Canada. That more than doubled. So they were already looking at that as a barrier. We think it was long overdue, because it is important that people come prepared. The last thing you want to do is give up everything at home and come here and then not be successful because you didn't know what was involved. But at the same time, they got hit again in January. Not only is there this new process, which isn't set up or ready, and so they've had to put their hopes and dreams in their application on wait, but there's also policy changes in there around the spouse's ability to work. And so if you were counting on bringing your spouse with you as part of your financial security, that's gone as well. So there are many more barriers now for international applicants, where they might look at Canada and say, my goodness, the amount of money I have to show, my spouse can't come and work, and the application process isn't set up, and it's more cumbersome now. I'm just going to, and I don't even know when I'm going to be able to apply. I'll just go someplace else. So we have thought about that, but that's our perspective. So we actually surveyed our applicants who are had already applied to us but are kind of in limbo right now. From what we can tell, the majority of them still plan to proceed with their application. But again, we can't survey and ask every day, and with the weeks passing, we don't know the impact of that, and that's a real possibility.
you were talking a little bit about before about the success rate you have in terms of your enrollment going right into jobs at NBCC, not just in St. Andrews campus, all across. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that success rate of all students that come to the college and are able to go right from getting their degree to? I know in St. Andrews, I see so many of them working summer jobs right away, and it's a really beautiful thing how interconnected they are in the community and working in the workforce, but you have a great average in terms of those who graduate and go right on to jobs.
Thank you so much, because we are very proud. It's over 90%, usually in the neighborhood of 93 to 94% year by year of our graduates who are employed, not just 1 year after graduation, but 3 years later, with the vast majority of them employed right here in New Brunswick, which is another good news story. You know, we talked about retention of international graduates earlier, but writ large, you know, our graduates are staying and contributing to the workforce of New Brunswick, which is really important to us as a publicly funded institution. But I think that speaks volumes of not only our commitment to learners and their success, but of the partnerships we have throughout our communities. We work so closely with industry, with employers, to make sure that the programs we deliver are in alignment with their needs. They provide applied learning, experiential learning opportunities for our students, which is critical to taking what you learn in the classroom and that theory and putting it in a real life situation and making sure that you know how to apply it and to do so successfully. And then on to graduations and employment by those same private sector partners. So, you know, it's a combination of our commitment, but no question the partnerships in our communities that make it a success story.
I think what the community college does so exceptionally well that deserves highlighting is how, as you said, works with industries or companies within communities to see what needs are, and you can help build an industry of workers around that. An example locally that's new that I'm learning more about every day is the Limestone Boat Company that's right here in Charlotte County and is teamed up with NBCC to train people to build boats, and you're helping establish an old industry on new terms here, which is unbelievable. Can you talk a little bit about how NBCC does that on a broader scale, looks at what community needs are, what businesses might need the workforce, and builds it? Yeah.
You know, Limestone is a great example. We've heard about boat building in this community, and you know, lots of needs around the industry, and so we're really excited by this new partnership, and they provided expertise to make sure that we had the right content and learning outcomes. So it's a pilot program. It's 12 weeks that will help with onboarding for their manufacturing plant. So that's just a first step, and that's how all partnerships start, right? With a bud, and we hope to turn that into a blossom. But we do that, as you say, throughout the province, not just through our regular full-time programming. We're constantly reviewing our curriculum to make sure that it stays up to date. But also sometimes there are needs outside of that, as you say, that are emergent, or they're responsive, or you know, it's something that doesn't require a full-time program, but is still a key need. And it could serve one employer, it could serve an entire sector. So there's lots of opportunity, and one of the things we pride ourselves on as a community college is being responsive to those needs. Not taking years to do something, but being able to turn it around and deliver it within months. You know, that's really important to us and to employers.
And I'm going to pivot and talk about housing in this community as well, since I'm talking a little bit more specifically about the campus right here at NBCC. We were talking about housing challenges when it came to international students, but NBCC is teaming up with, I think, all levels of government to look at potentially bringing a housing unit near the college right here in St. Andrews.
One of the beautiful things about being immersed in a community is the relationships that you build. And so we had met with town council a few years ago. We had seen declining enrollment here in St. Andrews. And, you know, at the time, I think we had hit a bottom of 218 students, and rightfully so. The community was worried. So we had a conversation with them, and we've increased over 38% in terms of enrollment in St. Andrews after those first conversations. And part of that is because we put together a college and community working group. You know, interested parties trying to say, how do we make this vibrant? And there are so many needs of students, and you're right to point out housing was one of them. That was one of the things holding back our enrollment growth. And it wasn't unique just to NBCC and the students we serve. We know from talking to employers that it was difficult for their workforce to find places to live. So, you know, one thing that a lot of people don't know is NBCC doesn't own its buildings and land. That is owned by the provincial government. However, we're able to work in partnership, as you say, with those levels of government, with our Government of New Brunswick partners, with our municipalities, and really provide as much data as we can about our students, the mix of students, the needs, the ages, whether they're, you know, when we're talking about housing, are they looking for single units? Are they looking for family units? What are the ages? What types of amenities are they looking for? Those are all components and things that are really important to our students, and, you know, frankly, align with workforce housing needs as well. So I think we're moving slowly but surely by working together. You know, it's not an NBCC problem or a community problem, it's a New Brunswick problem. Mm-hmm. And so we have to solve it collectively.
I know we've talked a lot today about the challenges posed by the cap on international student permits, but when you look at the grand scheme, what are the biggest challenges going forward for NBCC with mm-hmm. enrollment and just with keeping on the pulse of what's going on in New Brunswick?
Yeah. You know, I'm proud to say that NBCC has exceeded enrollment targets for the last 3 years. So our enrollment has been strong, but that doesn't mean that we don't have challenges. We've talked a lot about the critical moment facing New Brunswick. You know, we have the lowest post-secondary attainment, as I mentioned earlier. We have over 133,000 jobs. Job vacancies that need to be filled, and we have the highest percentage of jobs at risk of disruption due to automation and technological advancement. So it's a trifecta of things, and caught up in the middle of that, we have one of the highest youth NEET rates in the country, and NEET stands for not in education, employment, or training. So what that means for New Brunswick is for ages 18 to 20, or sorry, from ages 20 to 24, there's 18% or 8,700 youth not in any form of education, employment, or training. That's a lot of untapped potential, and the long-term risks to those individuals are important and significant if they don't become actively part of the community in some way through education or employment. And the national average is 13%. So if we were even looking to close the gap, that would be 2,400 more youth in some form of education or employment going forward. And it's just such a critical indicator of future life outcomes in terms of labor force participation, economic security, health, social. There are so many aspects that are impacted by the decisions they make today. So we really need to figure out what's happening here in New Brunswick that we have the highest rate, and what can we do to change that.
When you're talking to students who are maybe considering going mm-hmm. on to do post-secondary but still haven't made up their mind, what do you hear? What's the feedback, and what do you think is holding some people back and making our average higher?
Yeah, well, there's lots of things. You know, one of the things that we're seeing, certainly the pandemic had an impact on the educational experience of our youth, and so some of them say, you know what, that was not fun. It was not a good experience, and I don't want to continue. Mm-hmm. Right? We also know that we're challenged. We have some of the lowest math and reading scores in the country, and so if you have experienced difficulty in the learning process or didn't feel successful in school, whether you truly weren't or you just felt like you weren't, then you think, oh, that can't be for me. I won't be successful there either. There are so many barriers, and we actually did more than kind of take a read on those types of data points, but we interviewed and we talked to people that either didn't choose post-secondary or had tried it and dropped out. And we found 3 primary barriers. And one was occupational. They didn't know the jobs that were available and the pathway they needed to get there. Some of it was around preparation, right? Either they truly weren't prepared, they'd missed something in high school, so they thought, I'll just never be successful and I don't know how to make up that ground. Or had an experience and felt like they weren't prepared. Either way, it's enough to hold them back. You know, and then there are financial barriers as well. And it's not a matter, we have so many generous donors and organizations and associations that provide financial support for students, and that helps so many to not only stay enrolled but to complete successfully. But there are others that's not enough to close the gap. You know, they live further away from a campus, and so they can't, it's not just a matter of the money, but they don't have the transportation, or they can't afford to move. And so we really need to look at our province and its unique needs and try to break down barriers for more New Brunswickers so that every single person in our province has the opportunity to reach their full potential and to participate in meaningful work. So that's our goal.
And what are you most proud of when you look at some of the work you've done and what's to come for NBCC?
I think what I'm most proud of is that, you know, we faced the same challenges as other institutions, a declining domestic enrollment and a somewhat stagnant enrollment overall. And we could have thrown up our hands and said, oh, well, there's all these other factors, you know, that contributed to it. But because we're a purpose-driven organization and we care about the people and the communities that we serve, our team really rallied around welcoming more learners and figuring out, how do we look at our own institutional barriers? You know, obviously we don't intend to put policies and processes in place that prohibit students from coming, but it happens. So how can we look at ourselves and say, how can we reduce those barriers? You know, what partnerships can we do with education and early childhood development? So like our Essential Skills College Entry Pathway. How can we make it easier for students going from high school to see themselves in college and have a direct entry pathway? So that's something we're extremely proud of. It's in all high schools across the province this year. So we just, and what support services are needed to ensure their success. And so our community really rallied around that. That's something they could get. We're not interested in growth for growth's sake. That doesn't interest us at all. But being purpose-driven, changing people's lives, that's what gets us up in the morning and makes us come back every day despite policy changes that throw us for a loop. That's what compels us to work no matter what the odds are against us or what the challenges we face. And so what I'm most proud of is being part of a team that digs in and says, we're going to do it. We're going to overcome those odds, and we're going to do it because that's what's in the best interest of our communities, the communities we're part of.
Well, thank you, Mary, so much for sitting down with me today. I hope you will come back again soon.
I appreciate it. I will anytime.
My guest today has been Mary Butler, President and CEO of NBCC. I'm Vicki Hogarth. Thank you for watching Southwest Magazine.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO Television.